Next in the technical track, I'd like to introduce Schroeder. He's from New Zealand and has been working with Magento since the beginning, as far as I know, for at least seemed like it. He's well known in the community by his blog posts and other extensions. So, yep, he's speaking on API, third-party integrations, and thanks for being here.
Cool. Thanks very much for having me, Vinay. Welcome along, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about making the most of Magento APIs. So just before we begin, I thought I should introduce myself. So my name is Schroeder. I have a blog at aschroeder.com, and I've been leading the development of a service called orderpipe.com. So Orderpipe is a mobile sales dashboard for multi-channel e-commerce. So basically it picks up orders from various different sales channels and aggregates them all on a nice little display that works for iPhones, iPads, Android, that kind of thing. So it's great if you're wanting to check how the day's sales are going while you're out on the golf course or on the boat fishing. So in this talk, I'll be basing a lot of what I'm talking about with regards to APIs on our experience with building Orderpipe. So it's a service, and it calls the Magento APIs on behalf of a lot of different stores. So that sort of experience is where we've picked up a fair few tips in terms of performance. I also want, hopefully by the end of the talk, to have convinced a few people to consider APIs for a solution where they might otherwise consider extensions sometimes. I think there's a number of benefits that I'll cover to do with the APIs that would help where otherwise a simple small extension might be used. So firstly, can I get a little audience interaction by way of show of hands? Who's used the APIs for something? Okay, about half of us. Nice, nice. And did anybody not know there were APIs? Do we all know about them? Excellent, excellent. Okay, so the basics of it are you have the store there on the left, and all of the APIs available sit as external touch points for clients. And you can have more than one client, obviously, of the APIs. So Magento actually has 5 different APIs as of today, thanks to version 1.7. So basically at the start there was a simple SOAP service and the XML RPC service. And then as of version 1.3, they introduced what's called SOAP version 2. And the major change there was going from a sort of a dynamic core model to named services. And then more recently in version 1.6, they added a web service interoperability compliance. And so I'll cover that in detail in a few slides' time. But basically that helped static languages like Java and .NET better work with the Magento APIs. And then if you were at Roy's keynote this morning, you'll know, just announced, and if you'd had a chance to check out any of the release candidates in the last month or so, you'd have seen there's REST API now available in Magento. And the other kind of cool thing about that they didn't really make a big deal of was that it actually uses OAuth for authentication instead of the usual keys and credentials. So one thing that I will mention just when we're looking at this, so there's actually, if you are building a service like we were with Orderpipe where you want to be able to call lots of different Magento stores on behalf of people, if you're looking for maximum compatibility, you need to sort of pick an earlier API, because if you go too late in the process, then obviously like for example, if you build one on REST, then you're only going to be able to have 1.7 and above stores as clients. So it's worth considering when you're building your service, if you're building a service, that you pick an API version that's going to be suitable for your target market. Obviously, if you're just building a one-off integration, you can be a bit more selective with what suits you based on what the server will be running. So I wanted to talk about SOAP to start with. So this big convoluted mess of XML here is a snippet from a WSDL, or a web service description. And basically, a SOAP server, like the one that's installed on all the Magento stores, generates this and spits it out for the client to interpret. And basically, it's not really for humans to read. It just describes what services are available and what inputs and outputs you're going to get from it. And the good thing about SOAP, although in the case of Magento it's always over HTTP, SOAP itself is just describing the messaging itself. So in Magento it's by HTTP, but you could equally send SOAP via email if you wanted. So basically, knowing that there's a WSDL there is good, but you don't really have to care too much about it. Basically, when you use a SOAP client, so here's a very little snippet of a PHP one, you basically tell the client where the WSDL is, it goes and looks at it, understands what services are available, and then you just have to provide the credentials for the client so that it makes the call. And if you're at Bastian's talk earlier today, that part's optional, apparently. So you don't actually need that. So there's a security bug from version 1.5 and below, I think, where the API can be called without credentials, so something to be aware of. And then a similar sort of, and then after we've given the client the credentials, that's just a simple call that goes away and fetches a list of the customer groups in the store, but you can equally be fetching orders or customers or anything you like. And here's the same in Java, typically more verbose than PHP. The biggest difference here, so this has been generated against the version 1.6 Magento's WSI Compliance SOAP. And so what you can see here, and the benefit of a static language in this case, we haven't had to tell the the client where the server's WSDL is. So we do that statically at compile time. The Java tools can interpret that WSDL and generate classes so that you can then make your calls. I realize that's probably really hard to see, but you can basically make your calls against objects as if they were running locally, and the entire abstraction of the web service is sort of hidden away. So that WSI in 1.6 that sort of enables that, there's a new setting in the back end, the Magento Core API settings. You basically turn on the WSI compliance, and then that makes it really, really easy to use something like, so this is a web service import tool, which is bundled with, if you're familiar with Java, with the JAX libraries. And so you can just run that, it generates all of the class files, compiles them, and you're ready to start calling the APIs, just like you would call local methods on Java objects. I've actually included, so at the end of the slides I've got a link to some code, so if anyone's interested in the Java side of things or would like to see a bit more about how it all works, I've put some code in there, you'll be able to download and have a play around with it. So this is the sort of the big news, I guess, of today. So there's a RESTful web service now available in 1.7, and it also supports OAuth. So that's really, really exciting. I really like that. Basically, the really cool thing about it, so OAuth, probably everybody who's used Twitter or Facebook or any of these kind of large sites, you'll have had that experience where you log in with Twitter or log in with Facebook. And basically that's OAuth. So it's a way for a third-party service to have access to a site on your behalf. And so what typically happens is the third-party service will redirect you to, say, Twitter. You'll log in at Twitter and grant that third-party service access. So that flow from Magento, basically, you'll say, obviously we're not using this in Autopilot, but if we were, we would redirect the user to the Magento store, to their Magento store. They log in and are presented with a sort of a, do you want to allow Autopilot to access your store? And once they authorize, then they get redirected back to us. We get the credentials and can then start making requests on their behalf. So I think the really cool thing about this, and the thing that hasn't really been publicized yet, but you can actually, so it works for admin users, obviously, but the really interesting thing is it can work for customers as well. So as a customer of a Magento store, you can grant a third party access to that store on your behalf. So that opens up, it opens up the potential user base for Magento applications to just like hundreds or thousands more people than currently available, especially when you factor in that, say, 20% of some of the top e-commerce stores are running Magento. We're talking about potentially millions and millions of customers who could have their shopping experience enhanced by some sort of tool. To give you an example that kind of maybe would make that more concrete, you could imagine, say, UPS would make an iPhone app, and that iPhone app maybe would log into Magento stores on your behalf, determine your order details and tracking information, and then allow you to, say, schedule delivery or let you know if there's been a delay. Or another example, maybe, say, Amazon or eBay could write a browser extension that when you're on a Magento store offers to look at the product category of that Magento store and actually make recommendations based on your buying history at, say, Amazon or eBay. So the possibilities for taking advantage of this OAuth are really, really massive, and I'm quite excited to see what the community comes up with in terms of that. So this sort of glossed over this a little, but I did a big blog post about the REST API. So you can check that out on my blog. it kind of goes right through end-to-end process, explains how to do everything. So if you are interested in the REST OAuth stuff and want to have a play around with it, highly suggest that as a good starting point. So next, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I like about the APIs and why I think they offer a number of benefits over maybe everybody's go-to option of making an extension. So with the API, bugs aside, you can rely on getting the same data no matter what version of Magento the underlying store is running. So if you're building a service like we were with Autopipe, that's really great because we don't actually have to care what version of the store anybody's running. They can sign up. And sort of related to that, there's no installation of any extension required. We just need them to set up a web service user, and then they can begin using the service. So it just takes away one barrier that often people find makes it a little bit harder to use a service when they have to install an extension, and sometimes it's going to require developer involvement and all sorts of things. So another benefit with the APIs, you don't need to know so much about Magento to actually do something with the APIs. You don't need to know how to build an extension. You don't need to be certified. You don't need to have a lot of training. You just need to know how to call SOAP web services, and you can do it in your language of choice. You don't have to be a PHP developer either. So it gives you a number of options in terms of who can help you and what kind of implementation they can do. I'll talk about security in more detail in a few slides, but basically the APIs can be more secure, despite the exploit that was released this morning, but they can be more secure than the extensions for a number of reasons, and I'll cover that in more detail soon. And this one, so this is more specific to Autopipe. So the idea that once you're building an extension, it's typically that kind of software product model where you build it and then you sell a copy to somebody and you sell another copy. And if you're going to try and do licensing, it's hard. You have to implement your own licensing. You have to make sure people aren't redistributing copies of it. And you also obviously have to keep it up to date. So there's a whole lot of challenges with that model that an API-based service solution doesn't have to worry about. So we can push releases for Autopipe several times a day. Nobody has to worry about upgrading. And it also opens up that software as a service business model so that you can actually just charge a monthly amount and your clients can pay rather than having to pay you a one-off upfront fee for an extension. So having said all that though, there's heaps of reasons why you wouldn't want to use APIs as well. So the APIs can't do anything with user interface or events, which is a bit of a bummer. Unfortunately. So it does really limit, you can't add blocks, you can't listen for new orders, you can't be alerted when a customer changes their password, or any of that kind of interesting sort of stuff that you could do from an extension. So it's not for every problem, but there are certainly problems where an API has that ability. Also, not all of the core entities are available through the API yet. And obviously, if you add your own entities as part of your extension or some custom development, they are not going to be part of the SOAP service unless you add them. But the good news is it is actually easy to extend. Basically, all of the core services are implemented in the same way that you would do it yourself. So if you have a look at any of the API.xml files within core, you'll see immediately how it's basically binding core functionality to an external web service. And you'd do the same if you had your own data you wanted to expose. Of course, as soon as you require something to be installed to make that data available, you lose some of the benefit of using the API to start with. So it's a bit of a catch-22. One of the other things that you probably all already know if you've worked with APIs, it makes things just a little bit more complex. There's lots more moving parts, lots more things that can go wrong, firewalls, proxies, weird character encodings in HTML, and all that kind of stuff just ends up potentially causing headaches. So when it all works well, it's nice and easy, but when something's going wrong, it's much harder to debug because you've just got the potential for things to be going wrong somewhere between your system and the server. And the last one, which is kind of intuitive, anytime you're going to use an API, it's going to be slower than doing it natively from the PHP on the server, just because there's all of the overhead of actually doing the web service and getting the data to and fro. So yeah, plenty of reasons not to use an API and plenty of reasons to use them. So I guess it's a matter of picking the right kind of problems where the API can be a solution. So yeah, I mentioned earlier I wanted to talk a little about security. So with Autopipe, we actually check for weak keys and credentials and warn the user. And my first thing that I'll be implementing when I get a chance will be a warning that if they're running an old store, they should also upgrade. Now that I know about this web service exploit. So basically the idea there is because there's no real control on the number of requests coming into the API, short or weak keys are really vulnerable to brute force attacks. So you should choose really horrifically long ones because you don't need to type them very often. Also from the client point of view, from our point of view, we treat, and everybody should I guess, treat the credentials like you would a username and password. So you're going to want to encrypt them in case they ever get leaked out. Because with those, someone malicious could gain access to other people's stores, and that's a bad look. So the other really cool thing about security, and this all still stands despite the fact that there's a exploit in the web service code. Basically, with a extension, as soon as you install it, it has full access to your store. It can do whatever you like. And if you haven't reviewed the code, audited it yourself, or if you can't because it's encrypted, you basically don't really know what you're in for. And it can be malicious, or it could just be accidental. Like there's plenty of times where I'm sure people write extension code and not realize there's a vulnerability in it. Or maybe it just does something to your data that you weren't expecting. So by using APIs, you can restrict what the third-party services have access to. So for example, if you had a warehouse that was going to check stock levels, you would be able to just provide access to products and stock levels rather than also having access to orders and customers. So it's really important, especially in light of what Bastian was talking about this morning, that when you are picking the permissions and roles that you're granting to web service users, that you pick the smallest possible set that you can, so that in the case of any misuse or exploits, the web service is not being used to access any data that you wouldn't have wanted accessed. Right. So regards performance, so this has been a complex area for us with AutoPipe, just because initially we built it internally for our own needs and built a lot of the sort of data fetching algorithms with regards to that. And a lot of things change once you bring on clients that maybe get thousands of orders a day, or clients that only get a handful of orders a day. And so you need to be a little bit careful about how you run your web service client in terms of not overloading the server itself. So that's because the Magento server doesn't really have any controls or limitations on what a client can do. So there's no throttling like there is in many modern APIs that maybe would restrict you to say 5 requests per second or have some sort of a timeout. And likewise, you can ask for massive data amounts, and there's no pagination or anything, so the XML that comes back will be large. That can be an issue both for the server to actually generate it and send it, and for the client to actually parse it. I mean, most XML files of over a few megs are going to be pretty intensive. So one of the patterns that we use quite often that sort of allows for large clients and small is that you can ask for or fluctuating order amounts as well, I should say, is you can ask for a certain request, and maybe it's, say, the last 12 hours of orders, and if the response that comes back is too large, you can just split that up as, say, 6 2-hourly requests and schedule them over the next 10 minutes or 20 minutes so that you spread the work and load of that service across lots of smaller chunks. So that's applicable even if you're building just a one-off implementation on a store that has a high volume of orders. So then in terms of actually using the API to call, there's a few different patterns we've been experimenting with in terms of how to best get the data out without too much overhead. So unfortunately, the first and only one really available to you, unless you're prepared to install some custom functionality, is polling. So in that model, basically the client asks the server for any new or updated stuff, any data I should say, and it might need to do that several times if there's been no change. And then eventually, when there has been an order, you'll get a response back telling you about some new orders, and you can go away and fetch those. So the problem here, obviously, there's a lot of overhead. There's all those wasted requests where nothing was happening, and that's going to be a problem for the server and also the client. Also, if there's an outage for any reason, and you're only polling, say, asking for a window of the last few hours' orders, if something's down, when it comes back up, you're going to have missing data. And so you need to have systems in place that can go back, detect when there's been missed polls, and fill in those gaps. And I guess a couple of the things that can mitigate this, you can be a little bit more intelligent about how you schedule that polling. So if a store doesn't get very many orders, you don't need to poll every minute, because obviously most of the time those frequent polls are going to return nothing. likewise, if the store is getting lots and lots of orders, then frequent polling will be required either way. The problem, of course, is that less frequent polling is going to affect the real-time feel of the app. So if you only poll every 10 minutes, then it could be like 10-minute wait after an order comes in if the polling's out of sync. So yeah, you lose a number of the benefits really by slowing the polling down. Another thing that we're testing currently is the idea of pinging. So the annoying thing is you lose the benefit of APIs because you require something to be installed on the web store. So in this case, we put an extension in the store. It basically listens, excuse me, it listens for so it listens for new orders, and when those happen, it sends a ping to the server, the platform, notifying the platform like that, and then can proceed with a request as normal. So there's not been all of the wasted polls. We know exactly when an order's come in, and we can proceed to fetch those as normal. So it's a lot less wasted traffic. It's much closer to real time, but of course requires something to be installed, and that makes the barrier to entry just that much higher. So the last thing in terms of patterns, we use asynchronous fetches. So the idea there is we ask the server for a list of the updated records, say new orders. It sends them back to us, and instead of at that time making the detailed fetches to find out all of the information about those orders, we can just enqueue them into an asynchronous queue. And then as those come out of the queue, each one can request its particular order details, and we make those updates. Oops. So by doing that, we spread the load of a request, especially when there's lots and lots of orders, and it's good for the client and also the server, because servers don't want to have to spit out hundreds and hundreds of orders in a short amount of time. You're sort of implementing throttling that a lot of APIs have server-side on the client side that way. Right, so just to finish off, I wanted to have a look at a couple of sort of faux real-world examples. So if the problem was I want to send a list of my new customers or updated customers each day to my customer manager, that might be something that a lot of people would just immediately implement as a simple little extension. So here's an example of doing a similar kind of thing, but doing it with an API-based solution. It's not obviously production code. It's not very robust. Don't go putting this in production. But it's just more an example. So basically, we can grab out the customers, only the ones that have been updated in the last day, quickly format the data that we're interested in out of that response, and then email that through to our store manager. And likewise, if you say if you used a CRM, you could substitute that email call for a web service request that pushes those new customers to the CRM. So I think the point there I'm trying to make is that there's plenty of situations where a simple little script like that that uses APIs can replace all the maintenance burden of adding one more extension to your store. And then this example, so this is a REST example, and as I mentioned earlier, I go into a lot more detail of this on my blog post. So if you're interested in actually doing this stuff and playing around with it, you can check it out. But this is the sort of rough way that a REST API proceeds. So firstly, we have to get consumer tokens. So we get those from the Magento store. And so for example, I'll use AutoPipe as an example here. So as AutoPipe, we would ask a store to give us consumer tokens. And with those tokens, we can then make a request on behalf of the user. We forward the user based on a special URL to the site. So that authorized command, I should have mentioned, so that OAuth application, it's covered in the blog post, but that's the Ruby library. So it's just a nice, clean, simple little way of experimenting with this stuff if you do end up having a play around with it. So basically you're going to want to authorize, and that's going to spit out a URL where you kind of simulate being the user. You go to the Magento store, you log in, and you authorize the tokens. That gets you back tokens, and with that you can then request URLs. So you can see that fifth line down, the URI. So that's the path to the list of products in a RESTful manner. And basically we sign that URL, we get a special URL comes back, and from that we can then put that URL into any client that we like. So in this case I'm just using curl on the command line, but you could equally paste it into your browser or do what you like with it. The cool thing about the REST API is based on the accept content type header, you can actually tell the service what data you want back and in what format. So the example here, I've set it to application/XML, and that, sorry, the application XML will send me back the products formatted in XML. But if I change that to accept application/JSON, it will format the products in JSON. And so that makes it more useful if you've got a JavaScript client. Right, and so as I mentioned earlier, there's some deficiencies with the APIs. It's really easy to add your own, but it does require a third-party install. One of the recent innovations from Alan actually is a extension. He's called it Mercury, and I was lucky enough to get a preview, sort of a look at this in advance of this talk. It's basically an API extension that adds a lot of missing features from the core API functionality. So for example, he's added pagination. He's added a way of fetching entities that aren't already in the SOAP API. So if you're interested in doing a lot of stuff with maybe a specific integration where you do have an opportunity to install something on the site before you launch, I'd highly recommend checking it out just because it can make accessing entities that aren't already available really easy. And the other thing that's sort of going on in this space at the moment, if you've been to any of the eBay, PayPal-based talks about the e-commerce fabric, so Fabric is a sort of a web service architecture or bus that sends messages between various e-commerce services. And they are currently releasing, I think, maybe today, the ability for Magento to send messages onto that fabric. So as an alternative to a lot of the functionality provided by the core APIs, you could actually subscribe to various concerns on the fabric and be notified when new orders come in or when new customers sign up, for example. So yeah, that's pretty much the end. Hopefully after seeing that, you're all really keen to go and try out the REST OAuth APIs, or maybe you'd consider using the APIs for a project where maybe you would have previously used a small extension. And hopefully some of the benefits I'd outlined in terms of maintainability and ease of use would be available there. So yeah, that's it guys. If anyone's got any questions or comments, please let me know. If you'd like to try out any of the code examples that I've shown, they're all available on that GitHub URL, and I'll post these these slides up on my site. And as I mentioned, there's a really great sort of a worked example of the REST OAuth available on my site as well. And if anyone is interested in AutoPipe, so that's the multi-channel service that I mentioned and that we've been building, please give it a go. It's still in beta. It's free at the moment. And I'd really, really appreciate anyone's feedback on how they find it. So yeah, that's the end. If anyone got any questions I'd like to ask or comments.